Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Issues Forum online teachers workshop. Today, I'm very excited to have Ms. Andrea Berger. She's a senior research associate and a senior project manager based in London. So today, she's giving a lecture from the UK. So her research interests include North Korea's weapons of mass destruction program, sanctions and export controls countering proliferation finance, and non-proliferation and disarmament diplomacy. She has published several articles about the nuclear weapons ban treaty, and I included those articles in the list of useful reading materials for this year's program. So please make sure to read those articles. In addition, along with Gohan Muchhanova, who gave a lecture and the overview of the ban treaty for the teachers' workshop, and Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, who was awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize. Andrea hosted the Arms Control Wonk podcast talking about the nuclear ban treaty. So I hope you also listen to those episodes as well. So in addition to her full-time position with the CNS, Andrea is currently a visiting fellow in the Center for Science and Security Studies at King's College, London, as well as associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Prior to joining CNS, Andrea was the Deputy Director of the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Program at the Royal United Services Institute. She has a master's degree in international peace and security from King's College London and BA in political science from Carleton University. So I'm very excited to have Andrea for this year's CIF Teachers Workshop. So Andrea, now you have a microphone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Masako, and it's a real pleasure to be able to help with this workshop. I am going to talk a little bit today about some of the views for the ban treaty, particularly from non-participants in the ban treaty negotiations and from opponents of the treaty. And I should caveat here that while I'm going to be talking to that particular viewpoint, it's not necessarily my own. Indeed, in some places, I actively disagree with the views being put forward by opponents to the treaty. But nevertheless, sitting in the UK, which is one of the countries that does not agree with the ban treaty, its component parts and the drivers behind it, I have, I think, a reasonable understanding of where these outsiders are coming from in terms of their argumentation. So let me try to do my best to give a representation of those views. I'm going to do a few things in the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to lay out some of the views about the ban treaty from the P5, from so-called umbrella states that subscribe to the logic of nuclear deterrence but don't possess their own nuclear weapons. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of the pre-ban treaty initiative, so in particular the Humanitarian Consequences movement, and then talk about how those views evolved as it became clear that this movement was crystallizing in terms of a clear political effort to ban nuclear weapons. So let's start on that point. I think the important thing to note at the start is that this movement, as I'm sure my colleagues previously have talked about on these lectures, came from an initiative out of the 2010 review conference in particular, that referred to the need to focus more attention on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And so we had this series of international conferences, as well as a push for more humanitarian language and discussion in review conferences in the UN General Assembly from the period really between 2012 and the end of 2014. In the early days of that movement, indeed, when some of the humanitarian language was first plugged into the 2010 NPT Review Conference final document, very few of the P5 paid it very much attention, or I think realized the momentum, the steam that this this particular point of interest would garner over the next few years. However, there were, once actually conferences started to be held on this, once Norway held the first conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons in 2012, the ears of the P5 really did perk up to this, and there started to be some more active discussion amongst nuclear armed states over what the drivers for this movement was and where it might be going. And there were a few considerations as the Humanitarian Impacts Initiative unfolded. The first was this discussion in particular over to what extent countries wanted to have the discussion over humanitarian consequences of nuclear use, primarily for the intrinsic value of the facts-based conversation, the education value of discussing what the effects of these weapons were and reminding people of the types of grotesque consequences we saw when nuclear weapons were used at the end of the Second World War. Was it just that? Or were countries pursuing this for more political objectives? And if so, what were those objectives? Were they to delegitimize nuclear deterrence or to stigmatize nuclear deterrence? Was it to create momentum towards a political outcome like a nuclear weapons ban? One of the other potential kind of outcomes that P5 countries were discussing as you know, being potential aspirations of the humanitarian consequences movement was the push for a second International Court of Justice advisory opinion on nuclear weapons. So for those of you who may not be aware, in 1996, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion, which is, just as it says on the tin, advisory in nature, about nuclear weapons and situations in which nuclear use would be legal or would not, or would fit certain other international legal principles. And the decision is one that I think today, for many who are very actively pro-disarmament, didn't go far enough to declare that all nuclear weapons use scenarios would be completely illegal and in violation of international humanitarian law. Equally would be disproportionate, etc. The court reserved some room for debate really on extreme circumstances of national self-defense where the existence of the state was in question. Many in the disarmament community wanted to take that further, and there was therefore a fear amongst the P5 that eventually they would push for another advisory opinion in the International Court of Justice to recognize that the broader international discussion had moved on and actually firmer legal principles needed to be laid down about circumstances around nuclear use. So there's a questioning over the potential political aspirations, I think, of the humanitarian movement. There was also, in some cases in the P5, an internal tension caused in particular by some public attentiveness to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear use, in particular in the UK. Here we sit in a country that has a very active debate over both disarmament and nuclear deterrence, and governments, you know, whether they be conservative, whether they be Labour, all face this pressure to try to reconcile in some way these competing kind of public pressures for disarmament-focused language, but also deterrence-focused language. And so one constituency in the UK was definitely eager to drive forward the discussion over humanitarian consequences. As we'll get to a little bit later, Scotland is one of the parts of the country that was particularly interested in this narrative And so there's a domestic political dimension for some P5 countries as well when they were considering what the Humanitarian Consequences initiative might be about. Now, I think as I'll speak to you a little bit more in a moment, these views evolved and crystallized in different ways in nuclear armed states as the Humanitarian Consequences movement progressed. So to recap, the movement really had 3 conferences, and the first was held by the Norwegians. They had a very facts-based conversation about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear use. There weren't a lot of political conclusions drawn from the research that was presented. It was, strictly about laying out that research and promoting awareness and education about the consequences of another nuclear use scenario. Mexico, by contrast, pushed the limit on that and took it further. While Mexico, in the conference, there was more research presented on these consequences, the chairperson also made quite a political statement at the end of the conference that discussed some of the political conclusions that they had drawn from the discussion in the preceding days of the conference. Austria then kind of did a mix of both. They tried to draw a bit of an artificial line in the timing of the conference so that they would have an apolitical conference, but then immediately after the closure of the conference, they announced what subsequently became the Vienna Pledge or the Humanitarian Pledge, which clearly said that there was a legal gap over disarmament and nuclear weapons that needed to be filled, and there should be a push to prohibit nuclear weapons. So there's this bit of an artificial divide drawn between conference time and post-conference time with respect to the political takeaways from the conversation over humanitarian impacts. This, of course, leads to developments in P5 posturing. So the big question, given that there was some evolving concern over where this movement was going, the P5 really kind of had to decide how they wanted to position themselves with respect to the initiative. And I heard a lot of different views in the last few years put out about what the ideal way forward should be. Some countries, some officials, some experts felt that the way to go was to ignore the humanitarian movement entirely, to basically put it into a corner and forget about it, and eventually it would run out of steam. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that being suggested as an approach. In particular, the idea that the movement would kind of wither and die on the vine if enough time was allowed and if it was sufficiently ignored. Another group of officials, experts, countries, depending on where you were sitting within nuclear armed states, suggested that there should be engagement. And here the question was, to what end? So was it to try to steer, to engage in order to steer the initiative away from the things that nuclear weapon states felt was sensitive, the bits in particular about delegitimizing deterrence? Should there be an effort to engage in order to get the movement to become something else? That was, again, less sensitive. So there's a bit of a debate there about what should be the approach taken by nuclear armed states. And then the question became, well, should whatever posture is decided be a posture that is decided by the P5 as a cohesive unit? Now, I don't want to at all suggest that the P5 are cohesive. We know indeed from any discussion over the strategic considerations between the P5 that they are, for the most part, at odds with each other over pretty much everything in the nuclear sphere, and especially when it comes to deterrence and disarmament policy. You have some countries that try to orient themselves as at least understanding the kind of frustrations that non-nuclear weapon states have. You have others who don't care to recognize that at all. There are obviously major security issues between countries with nuclear weapons. So they're never going to be unified, but one of the questions was, in this specific respect, should countries adopt a unified P5 voice when messaging towards the states that were supporting a humanitarian movement? And initially, there was a common P5 declaration made in the NPT review cycle. The P5 messaged on the same page, they coordinated themselves before, and they declared that they would not attend the conference in Norway. After Norway, that P5 coordination and cohesion on this issue started to dissolve. The US in particular had discussions with the Mexican government in advance of their conference in Nayarit to see if there was a way that the Mexican organizers could make the United States sufficiently comfortable to participate in one of these conferences. The US eventually decided that no, there was not sufficient kind of assurances given, and so they did not attend in Mexico. They did, however, eventually decide to attend the third conference in Vienna. And that again was after significant deliberations with the Austrian organizers. And the Austrian organizers made a number of concessions and promises. They pledged behind closed doors that they would refrain from having a politicized chair's statement at the end of the conference. And as I mentioned before, they did do that, but they just kind of called time on the conference and then made their political kind of pitch at the end of it. They also said and provided assurances that nuclear weapon states that participated in the Vienna conference would have their views reflected in a final document. And they allowed the scope of the agenda to be expanded to include radiological weapons, which gave the US a little bit more that it could talk about in terms of the threat landscape and consequences and scenarios of use. The US announced quite late in the day that it would be attending. And one of the reasons for that was because they had a very heated internal debate. And the decision to attend, I think, came down quite notably to key personalities within the United States, in particular, Rose Gottemoeller, who's at the time, I believe, Undersecretary for State, was a significant voice pro-engagement for the United States on the humanitarian movement issue. So that argument won. The United States announced that it would attend the conference in Vienna. The UK announced shortly thereafter that it would also attend, and that was a decision that was probably made easier by the fact that the Americans had announced they were going. However, it was still extremely controversial in the UK, and from everything I have heard, went straight to the top of the chain in 10 Downing Street for a decision. One of the other considerations that seems to have also swayed the UK was that a delegation from the Scottish National Party announced that it would attend the conference in Vienna. And there was some reluctance, at least in certain corners of government, to allow the Scottish National Party to be the representatives present from the UK. They would have been the only ones there, though indeed they would not have been in a position to speak for the UK government. There was still a hesitation about having them be the sole British voice in the room. China, for the Vienna conference, did a middle ground measure and sent a representative of a government-linked think tank. So they attended as well. France and Russia, of course, have maintained firmly throughout that they will not engage with this initiative. They had no desires to interact at all on the subject of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And I saw some pretty heated exchanges at the 2015 review conference over the idea that there was new information that was useful that was being shed by the humanitarian movement about the consequences of nuclear use. The French in particular rejected that idea outright. The Russians as well have said that they throughout that they would not engage with us. So the posturing really differed depending on where you were sitting in nuclear armed states. One of the key developments that is noteworthy as well is the Marshall Islands case, which arose in 2014 and really dragged on through 2016 as the political dynamics of the humanitarian movement were starting to emerge. So for those who are not familiar, the Marshall Islands in April 2014 lodged a series of cases with the International Court of Justice against all of the nuclear armed states, including Israel, DPRK, India, and Pakistan. And they accused those countries of basically violating their obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament under the NPT. Now, this was a difficult legal argument to make, especially for countries outside of the NPT. So the Marshall Islands tried to argue that Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty had formed customary international law that therefore binds the DPRK and Israel and India and Pakistan, which is a pretty ambitious legal argument to make. But the Marshall Islands filed suits on all 9 countries with the International Court of Justice. Now, some of those countries obviously did not and still do not recognize ICJ jurisdiction on nuclear weapons issues. And so immediately their suits were put aside. Some countries were therefore also not in the NPT, so it seemed highly unlikely that any case against those countries would get off the ground. And that left the UK, because the UK only 2 years before, as part of a coalition government agreement between the Liberal Democrats, who were in favor of tighter restrictions on nuclear weapons and a move towards a lower nuclear posture for the UK. That coalition with the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, on the other hand, resulted in an acceptance of ICJ jurisdiction on nuclear weapons issues. What then occurred is that obviously the UK was subject to jurisdiction by the ICJ when the Marshall Islands suit was filed. It was also a member of the NPT and therefore bound by Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as a result of the intersection of those two things became the test case for whether or not this court challenge would fly. After almost 2 years of argumentation, actually maybe a little bit more, I believe, the court concluded that there was no dispute. In particular, there was no evidence that the Marshall Islands had repeatedly raised in either private channels or in public channels direct issues over Article 6 with each of these countries individually. And therefore no legal dispute existed that the court could weigh in on. That was in the UK seen as a huge relief because they were also preparing themselves for something of a drawn-out legal battle. Indeed, the decision that there was no jurisdiction and no case in this particular instance was also one that was fairly narrowly decided by the ICJ judges. And what I think the UK's lesson from some of this was that they never wanted to again be in a position where a non-nuclear weapon state could, so to speak, pull the trigger on Article 6 and really exert concrete legal pressure on the United Kingdom to take action on a timeline that it was not in itself voluntarily subscribing to. And so what the UK did after the Marshall Islands case in early 2017, February 2017, is changed its policy on the ICJ's jurisdiction. It said that the International Court of Justice would not have jurisdiction to rule on nuclear weapons issues related to the UK unless it decided that all of the nuclear weapon states were party to the suit or to the case. And because most of the other nuclear weapon states don't recognize ICJ jurisdiction, the UK has in effect put forward a policy that means that the Marshall Islands will never be able to bring up a revised suit against the UK again. So this was happening at the time of the humanitarian impacts movement, at the time when this movement was becoming a movement for a nuclear weapons ban. And a nuclear weapons ban, if you think about it, is similar to the Marshall Islands case. Countries, non-nuclear weapon states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty don't really have a way to address non-compliance with Article 6. It's a problem with the way the NPT is structured. Back when the NPT was first negotiated, one of the UK officials who was doing the negotiations recalled that there would be this problem in the NPT because while you could go to the Security Council to enforce non-proliferation related breaches, there was nowhere really that non-nuclear weapon states would be able to go to enforce the disarmament provisions in Article 6. And so he said that the review cycle would become a way for non-nuclear weapon states to hold the gun to the head of the nuclear armed. The problem was that they've never had a way to pull the trigger. And so both the nuclear weapons ban treaty and the Marshall Islands case are attempts by non-nuclear weapon states to do just that, to find a trigger that can be pulled to exert concrete pressure on those who rely on nuclear weapons for their security. And the lesson for many of the P5 officials, I think, that I've engaged with has been that they never want to leave the door open to a trigger being pulled like that again. So the Marshall Islands case is a good example where they've closed that door, and the ban treaty is another. But before I touch on how opponents of the nuclear weapons ban initiative postured once the ban actually got underway, I wanted to briefly touch on umbrella states because they're in a really interesting position in regards to all of this. It's so often when we talk about NPT politics that we talk about nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, when in fact, in this particular circumstance, there's actually this group of non-nuclear weapon states that relies on nuclear weapons for their security, or believes that they do. And so their constituency here that needs to be considered as well, and they've had different views on how to approach the development of a nuclear weapons ban as well. Umbrella states, so many of the umbrella states in the 2013 Preparatory Committee for the Non-Proliferation Treaty issued a joint statement about humanitarian consequences. They were engaged in this movement as well, felt that they had to be prepared to talk about the consequences of nuclear use, and so promoted it. Indeed, Norway, a NATO ally, held the first Humanitarian Consequences conference in 2012. Most of the umbrella states attended all three of those conferences. They attended what was called the open-ended working group, which is something my colleague Gauhar may have talked about, which was the kind of stepping stone between the humanitarian conferences and the actual agreement to mandate negotiations over a nuclear weapons ban. That UN mandated group discussed basically next steps for disarmament and concluded that there was a need to fill the legal gap in the way that the Austrian pledge had outlined. So they participated in that too. The thing is, their comfort level in engaging with this initiative changed over time. Already at the time of the Mexico conference in Nayarit, it was clear that there were some umbrella states that had identified that this was moving towards a political track and were not happy with it. I would encourage you to go take a look at the German statements that were made in Nayarit, which were pretty firm on this point. And by Austria, certainly many of them were very uncomfortable. They too have public opinion to think about. In quite a number of NATO allies, in Japan and South Korea, there is a constituency that's very pro-disarmament, and that rejects the role of nuclear weapons in national security. Germany is a great example where US nuclear weapons are stationed on German soil, but there is a strong anti-nuclear lobby in Germany, and something of an attempt to keep that public discussion from bubbling up over the surface to the point that government needs to confront it head on. So umbrella states, I think, grapple with the tensions between having to, maintain a pro-disarmament and an engagement-oriented approach to those who supported the humanitarian movement, but also still recognizing their own belief in the hard security deterrent benefits of being in a nuclear alliance. And so that tension has really played out over the past few years for these countries. Key countries, like I mentioned, to look at as case studies for this. Norway is a good example. Again, they've had some political changes internally that have meant that they went from hosting the first humanitarian conference to boycotting the negotiations over a nuclear weapons ban. Australia has been more towards the opposing side throughout, and indeed, has been one of the more vocal opponents as this issue has progressed. Japan, unsurprisingly, having been the only country to have suffered an actual nuclear attack, which has still a strong memory, a strong civil society movement that wants to ensure that there is, very active education around the effects of nuclear weapons, but yet remains in a firm nuclear alliance faced by nuclear adversaries in Northeast Asia. And then there's the Netherlands that has, not dissimilar from Japan, a very, very active civil society movement that is anti-nuclear, especially given that the Netherlands is also a basing state for US nuclear weapons. And their parliament actually, as I'll get to in a moment, their parliament actually mandated that the Netherlands participate in the nuclear weapons ban treaty negotiations. So a Dutch delegation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was present throughout, and was an active participant in the negotiations over the treaty text. So, what is the opposition all about? That was kind of the view, the skepticism on the humanitarian movement. Countries didn't want to see that movement translate into, firmer political action that exerted pressure on nuclear weapon states to disarm, exerted pressure or tried to undermine the role of extended nuclear deterrence. They weren't comfortable with that, but really the opposition to a ban treaty specifically was very clear. None of the umbrella states wanted a ban treaty that would preclude them from relying on nuclear weapons for national security, and certainly none of the nuclear armed states wanted it. Why? There are quite a number of reasons that are given, but I've laid out here on the slide what are some critical ones. The first one is this idea that while nuclear weapon states in the NPT have signed up to pursue effective measures towards nuclear disarmament, they have not signed up to pursue ineffective measures towards nuclear disarmament, and a ban treaty would be one of them. Why? Because a ban treaty does not, in the minds of opponents, address the security drivers that lead countries to rely on nuclear weapons. Insecurity between nuclear armed adversaries or the fear of potentially one day facing an overwhelming, existentially threatening attack from another country, whether from conventional weapons or nuclear weapons, leads some countries to want to maintain nuclear weapons or be part of a nuclear alliance. And a ban treaty, in their mind, simply does not recognize that. So if you want to effectively pursue nuclear disarmament, you need to start to unwind those security motivations. This is why nuclear weapon states have long advocated in the non-proliferation treaty context a so-called step-by-step approach, which tries to, one step at a time, even though it's slow-moving, address those issues, bring countries further into a process of arms control until one day there's a position reached where you could disarm entirely. So that's the first idea. The second narrative that was really put out about why a nuclear weapons ban was a bad idea was that it would distract or detract from the non-proliferation treaty. The non-proliferation treaty is always talked about as being the cornerstone of the international disarmament and non-proliferation regime. There were a lot of concerns expressed that a ban treaty would take attention, political capital, and initiative away from trying to strengthen the NPT, and would really kind of poison the NPT atmosphere. That's actually a word that got used quite a lot. There may be some fear-mongering there. I think that's one of the ones that will have to remain to be seen, but we can talk about it a little bit more towards the end of my presentation. Again, as I indicated before, one of the other objections that it would undermine previous agreements, in particular in the NPT, frameworks for step-by-step disarmament, so gradual disarmament. That model, if you will, is one that suggests that a prohibition on nuclear weapons is the last chapter in the disarmament story. So in a step-by-step framework, you pursue all these steps until the point at which you can prohibit nuclear weapons and effectively disarm. The ban treaty movement puts that last chapter first. It flips the book on the disarmament story, and instead says that you need to lay down a normative marker and try to build norms against nuclear weapons first, regardless of whether or not the security situation is going to facilitate it. And nuclear weapon states are not happy with that reordering of the disarmament story that they thought they'd settled in the NPT context. There's also objections to how the ban initiative will in practice target umbrella states in particular, because one of the ways in which this initiative will play out politically probably is that it will create most political pressure in democratic countries where there is already an active debate over nuclear weapons. And that includes countries like the UK and US, but mostly umbrella states. And also it could create practical issues for the operation of extended nuclear deterrence by undermining other ways in which military alliances that have nuclear weapons operate. So parties to a ban treaty, for example, could prevent the transit of military forces that might have nuclear weapons aboard, could try to attack the financing structures for parts of nuclear complexes, these sorts of things that would impact extended nuclear deterrence. Ban opponents thought it would entrench divides. They noted that also some nuclear armed states would never join. The DPRK, they said, would never join a nuclear weapons ban treaty. And so in light of that, the US and its allies can't either. As long as those countries stay outside of these frameworks and have nuclear weapons, the United States is not going to be able to countenance the idea of joining. And they also rejected the ban treaty initiative on the basis of the idea that there will be something next. And indeed, the ban itself lays out a framework for future agreements to be appended to it. So again, this continuing concern over where the road goes from here. It was the same type of concern that existed at the time of the humanitarian impacts movement. I wanted to show briefly an example, however, of how I think these concerns were being badly articulated. During the March negotiations over the nuclear weapons ban, right at the beginning, Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, held a press conference, basically a counter press conference to the ban talks, and got a quite random assortment of NATO allies behind her and declared some of these objections to the treaty initiative. And I just wanted to show them to you because I think they're probably not the best expression of these objections, but were some of the only clear, coordinated verbal messaging attempts around the time that ban talks actually got started. So bear with me just while I change my screen here so I can show this to you.
To stand here basically just to have our voices heard. Suddenly the General Assembly wants to have a hearing to ban nuclear weapons. As a mom, as a daughter, there is nothing I want more for my family than a world with no nuclear weapons. But we have to be realistic. Is there anyone that believes that North Korea would agree to a ban on nuclear weapons? So what you would see is the General Assembly would go through in good faith trying to do something, but North Korea would be the one cheering, and all of us and the people we represent would be the ones at risk. Is it any surprise that Iran is supportive of this? It's not. You are going to see almost 40 countries that are not in the General Assembly today. And that's 40 countries that are saying, in this day and time, we would love to have a ban on nuclear weapons. But in this day and time, we can't honestly say that we can protect our people by allowing the bad actors to have them, and those of us that are good trying to keep peace and safety not to have them.
And now, with round-the-clock updates from Reuters journalists, here.
So that's Nikki Haley trying, I think, to articulate, in particular, the idea, pardon me, let's do that again. So that's Nikki Haley trying to articulate the idea here that I've got on the slide, that some nuclear armed adversaries will never join and therefore others can't either. That you can't expect those, I think she termed them good guys, to basically sign on and engage with your initiative if you're not going to address all nuclear issues in an effective way. I think there's some real limitations to that argument, but that's what really the sole message being put forward at the time was about this. So when ban talks were mandated, they were mandated in the form of Resolution L41 in the UN General Assembly. And L41 was the point at which the humanitarian initiative and the open-ended working group that followed it really crystallized into actually this is going to be about prohibiting nuclear weapons. And as a result of that, the nuclear weapon states and their allies really started the counter campaign. Before there had been definitely some kind of behind the scenes discussions to lay out some of the discomforts that we've talked about, but it wasn't an overt political campaign, and that started much more with this resolution, where opponents of a ban treaty tried to undercut the support for the initiative. There's a lot of lobbying at the UN General Assembly. this caused, I think, the stances of the nuclear-armed and umbrella states to harden, with a few exceptions of those who really, did want to keep a bridge-building role open for themselves. And there were a few states caught in the middle again as well. There was some states that were obviously discomforted, not necessarily those that have an umbrella relationship with the United States, but those who I think were concerned about just the pace at which the ban treaty initiative was moving, and the fervor with which supporters were trying to promote this idea of a treaty. So Switzerland and Sweden, for example, I think were some of those who felt a little bit like they were caught in the middle of these factions, if you will, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty context, in the General Assembly context. So ban negotiations, again, how, we saw Nikki Haley there in terms of how the US and its allies were posturing at the start of these talks. China, for its part, actually seems to have flirted with the idea of attending, and I'm not really sure how far that went, but there were discussions about whether or not China would actually participate in the negotiations. Russia and France did not entertain that idea at all, and they were never going to. They have been the firmest opponents of all of this, and with the idea that there should be any engagement with ban supporters about disarmament issues. The Trump administration, however, aside from Nikki Haley's press conference, was really a non-force during ban negotiations. I thought there was going to be a lot more lobbying on this, kind of from outside the chamber to get states to back down from certain positions, to pressure them to even, become backseat participants to the negotiations. But there really wasn't a coordinated campaign. And that's probably partly to do with the fact that the Trump administration was, at the time of the ban negotiations, embroiled in a nuclear posture review. So it, aside from North Korea, pretty much had no confirmed nuclear policy direction. And therefore, getting kind of the diplomatic license to go forth and do this very active counter campaign was just premature. It wasn't there yet. The UK and some of the umbrella states, even though they weren't participating in the negotiations, did engage with the chair of ban talks at various stages in the process, particularly earlier on. And the Netherlands, of course, because of parliamentary pressure, did attend. So it was actually the only NATO ally that was sat in the room throughout the negotiations, and they participated very, very actively, trying to refine text in a way that they thought would make the treaty better. So really, I have a lot of appreciation for the fact that the Netherlands attended and was, I think, something of a constructive participant in the talks. The reaction from opponents, however, once the treaty was concluded, took the general objections that we talked about before and made them much more specific. So previously, these ideas that, the ban would detract from the NPT, that it wouldn't be effective, that it wouldn't meaningfully expand a norm in a way that, actually addressed security risks. Those general objections were all put out there before. When there was an actual text that was agreed, immediately these objections started to be framed by opponents in a much more specific fashion. So let's talk through some of those briefly. Firstly, they have started to argue that the treaty is sloppy, it's unhelpful, it's actively damaging. And there are key areas of the treaty that bring them to that conclusion. In terms of the preamble, for example, there's objections to the fact that the preambulatory language goes beyond the 1996 ICJ advisory opinion. So it misinterprets some of the international legal decisions that have been made in order to try to advance a norm. And that, from a legal standpoint, is something that opponents of the treaty object to. Like they talked about before, it targets extended deterrence very directly. So in the core prohibitions to the treaty, it prohibits nuclear stationing, it prohibits assistance in any activities that would be contrary to other core prohibitions against possession, use, stockpiling of nuclear weapons, etc. Those are all things that try to get at the mechanics of extended nuclear deterrence. It tries to get at the mechanics of burden sharing arrangements that NATO has, for example. And that, as we discussed previously, is something that opponents of the treaty think basically validates the certainty they had before that this is the direction the ban would take. They also note that it sets back the CTBT norm, and here this is probably a discussion that needs more time than we have, but there was a very active debate in the negotiations over how testing should be featured in the treaty. Many felt that if you didn't have testing in the core prohibitions, that the treaty would be, it would be an obvious normative gap. Others were uncomfortable about treading on the toes of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which already exists, though is not in force. And several delegations in the room are, of course, not party to the CTBT. So Egypt is a good example. And those countries pushed back pretty hard on any idea that there should be references to the CTBT. The only place I think they allowed those references in was in preambulatory language. In the section of the treaty that talks about relationships with other legal instruments, the CTBT is not mentioned. There's no positive acclaim in the operative parts of the text for the CTBT's international monitoring system. And so opponents really are dissatisfied with the way that those negotiations went, and the way in particular that some countries who currently object to the CTBT were able to steer language away from supporting a treaty that is widely recognized as being one of the next steps for nuclear disarmament. There's also a lot of attention paid to the safeguards and verification provisions in the treaty, which opponents feel are entirely inadequate. I must confess, I find them really sloppy and messy as well. I think many of the ban treaty's most ardent supporters realize that they're sloppy and messy provisions and probably could have been quite a bit better with time. But one of the key problems in that text is it refers back to a safeguard standard which is several decades out of date, which is not suited to verifying the non-diversion of materials, in particular in the event of an attempt by a country in the ban to break out or pursue clandestine nuclear weapons activities. That in order to have more confidence that the parties to a ban are not pursuing activities that violate the core prohibitions, that you would have needed an additional protocol, at least, if not more. And again, because some of the countries in the room, like Brazil, who were quite influential, do not support an additional protocol, there was, an attempt to water down the language in order to satisfy those countries. And opponents of the treaty feel that if you wanted to really make a significant advancement of a norm that would, form a positive contribution, that they should have been willing to set aside those individual country concerns over an additional protocol, recognize that a majority supported the additional protocol, and put that in because it's essential for verifying compliance with the core prohibitions that the treaty includes. The verification protocols for countries with nuclear weapons to accede to the treaty are also regarded as being messy and unfeasible and kicking the can for a lot of the decisions to an uncertain future point in time. There's more information about those arguments that I can direct you towards if you're interested. But the final big specific objection to the treaty is about Article 18 of the treaty, which talks about the treaty's relationship with other legal instruments. And that's basically a reference to the NPT and in some way to the CTBT, though I think the lawyers struggled with how to reference or indicate that there was some nod to the CTBT when the CTBT is not yet in force. The problem with Article 18 from the perspective of opponents is that Article 18 basically only recognizes legal obligations in other treaties if they are compatible with the nuclear weapons ban. And what, in the opinion of the lawyers of the Netherlands and Sweden and others, what that does is create a legal hierarchy where the ban treaty supersedes the NPT. And if the NPT is really a cornerstone, they felt that that language should have been different. I personally agree with that, especially because having sat through negotiations, I also realized that there were several fairly easy fixes to that language that could have been made if countries had, I think, been engaging all of the delegates within the room who had these sort of creative solutions to some of these problems. There was clearly a push to get the treaty done by the 7th of July, and so those small fixes didn't have time on their side in order to further improve the treaty in a way that might have undercut some of these arguments from opponents. Key statements I would like to direct you towards, there's really three, if you're trying to understand the position of opponents at this time, there's really three that you should read. The first is the statement by the P3, the UK, US, and France, immediately after the conclusion of the ban treaty that says, I'll show it to you in a moment, that says that those countries will never, ever, ever, ever sign a ban, really, and lays out some of the reasons why. Then there's a really excellent longer form refutation of the ban from Chris Ford, who's basically the White House's current advisor for nuclear issues, who's about to go to the State Department. But he, in an event with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, does an extended refutation of the ban and lays out what I think is a fairly representative argument of the wider opposition from other nuclear states as well. And then there's a statement from the North Atlantic Council, which was made at the time that the ban treaty was opened for signature, that reiterates some of the points seen in the other statements as well. Here is the statement from the P3, and I've underlined, I think, some of the key points if you're trying to appreciate where it is that these countries are coming from. The first is the clear language at the front of the statement that the three countries do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to the nuclear weapons ban treaty. That language is inserted by lawyers. And the reason it's inserted by lawyers in that way is to demonstrate that the three countries are what we call persistent objectors, that they have objected to this treaty all the way along and will continue to, and have no intention to ever allow for the development of what's called customary international law. Basically, where state practice informally starts to evolve in a way that suggests that even though they're not party to a treaty, they can still be bound by the terms of that agreement. The three countries flatly reject that there will ever be room for the development of customary international law around the provisions of a ban. They will not be bound by anything in the ban and intend to stay outside of it for that reason. So that language is unfortunately now filtering into most of the statements from the US, UK, and France on disarmament issues in pretty much any forum. And that is, I think, creating some barriers to bridge building between parties within the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Other things of note in here, they say, again, that the treaty disregards the realities of the international security environment. They accuse it of creating divisions, and they say, we'll get to this in a minute, that it offers no solution to the grave threat posed by North Korea's nuclear program. So those are some of the key accusations in the P3 statement. North Korea, I'm sad to say, has, in the context of the Ban Treaty Initiative, been a little bit of something for everyone. On the 4th of July, while we were in the middle of the kind of period of bringing the final revisions on the nuclear weapons ban text to fruition, North Korea tested an ICBM. And as a result of that, there was a huge amount of posturing around the North Korea issue, specifically in relation to the ban by both proponents and opponents of the treaty. Opponents use the North Korea example to say the following: the treaty doesn't take North Korea into account. North Korea won't join, so others can't. That the North Korea situation reinforces the importance of security-centric disarmament, if you can call it that. That basically, you can't expect disarmament to proceed on this sort of normative, aspirational path if you have countries like North Korea who are threatening to turn South Korea into a sea of fire and to nuke the White House. And therefore, security-centric disarmament is the only stable disarmament pathway, an effective disarmament pathway to pursue. And they also say that North Korea, the situation in North Korea shows how keeping the Non-Proliferation Treaty strong is vital. We have to strengthen that treaty, so basically we don't have more North Koreas, and the ban treaty is going to fracture countries and that constituency, not help them build stronger relationships that build stronger non-proliferation frameworks. Proponents, on the other hand, say that it's ridiculous that the ban treaty should be expected to address the DPRK problem. Indeed, no one else seems to be addressing the DPRK problem very well. In fact, the DPRK situation shows how dangerous and unstable the current situation is, shows the flaws in their view around relying on the idea of deterrence, and that really we need to delegitimize these weapons now so that North Korea and Trump in retaliation do not have any space to suggest that they're behaving responsibly or taking moral high ground. And we also need to delegitimize those weapons to ensure that other countries clearly realize that any potential pursuit of nuclear weapons is intolerable. So again, a little something for everyone in the North Korea situation. It's being exploited pretty actively by all sides of this debate, and is one that's open to further discussion. So I would really welcome your questions or opinions on this as well. So my last slide, very briefly, in thinking about the implications of a ban treaty, because there's very strong rhetoric both from proponents of a ban and from opponents of a ban about what the treaty is not going to do or is going to do. I've kind of laid out here on the slide the way that I intend to think about the implications of the treaty going forward. And I've got 5 rough, if you can call them, baskets of implications. You'll notice that they make an acrostic for Nobel, so as an easy way to remember them. The first one is normative progression and regression. I will be watching to see where actually we can detect norms being developed, either in a positive way or where norms are being unwound. So in a positive way, we might have, stronger norms over nuclear testing, stronger norms against nuclear use. On the other hand, it's possible that we see norms over safeguards or verification actually, being unwound because of the haphazard way in which those provisions were negotiated in the ban treaty. So I'll be watching that as well. Then there's the opposing disarmament model question. And really here I come back to that, is the ban the first chapter or the last chapter in the disarmament story? And the fact that countries disagree on that so vociferously means that it's going to be hard potentially to lay out a pathway forward for disarmament progress that people agree on. And so the question here is, if there's no space for security-centric disarmament discussions, and those who actually have nuclear weapons or rely on them don't want to talk about the ban model type of disarmament, what's the middle ground? Is there a common basis that remains that allows us to move forward and make positive progress together? Or are we going to be having rhetorical battles for forever about which model is right? So that's my second kind of question about implications. Then we get to battles in relevant forums, and here in particular, I mean the NPT review cycle and potentially the UN General Assembly. Consensus-based settings are probably the place in which we might see the greatest number of battles, because there you could envision that countries who supported a ban wholeheartedly will want language in consensus final documents positively referencing the fact that this treaty exists, hailing what's in it, the norms that it promotes. And of course, opponents to the treaty will never let that happen. We saw, I think, a little bit of this play out in 2015 already, where Austria insisted that the Humanitarian Impacts Initiative be referenced in an NPT final document and be positively commented on, and the French said, "Over my dead body." So these types of battles can play out again, potentially particularly in consensus forum. But I think we should also remember that there may be a bit of overstatement over the potential for all of these fora to fall apart because of disputes over the ban. And I think in particular about some of the ongoing meetings about the fissile material cutoff treaty. There's a group of experts that's currently discussing how to advance fissile material restrictions. They don't seem to have their discussions plagued by the ban treaty. It's possible that other environments won't either. So I think we need to nuance this area, but watch it closely. Fourthly is easing disarmament pressure. And I know that may sound counterintuitive, but actually what I see starting to happen is that the ban treaty movement, and indeed the advent of a treaty, has led the countries that support it away from exerting concrete, specific expectations of the P5. So to give you an example, in the previous NPT review cycle, non-nuclear weapon states clearly said to the P5, we expect you to report on your disarmament progress in 2014 and give us a reporting template. We want to see more quantitative transparency. And, we want to see additional progress in US-Russia bilateral arms control. And gave some specific details of what that expectation was. Specific coordinated pressure on the P5. That seems to be evaporating in favor of kind of general pressure, about high-level norms. And what we're losing is therefore, I think, the coordinated expectation being placed on on the US and Russia that they extend New START, for example. That seems to be, a pretty easy step that should be taken. 5 years extension. Why are we not making coordinated calls for this? That type of pressure, I think, is dissipating and potentially as a result of a ban. So easing disarmament pressure, watch that space. And then finally are the legal or practical implications for US alliances. And here this will probably come down to which countries sign and ratify a ban and what interpretation of some of the vague provisions within a ban they articulate. So, for example, you might have some countries who are maybe significant in terms of joint exercising with the United States in certain parts of the world. If they join a ban and indicate that they're no longer comfortable with certain nuclear-powered submarines or whatnot taking part in those exercises, we may have an issue. There may be practical implications for US alliances. Similarly, on the financing side, if you have some countries come out and say, we're declaring in national law that we're no longer going to finance anything that has ever touched the US national laboratory complex that deals with nuclear weapons, there could be some practical implications there as well. Or say, we're not going to finance certain projects of the Dutch or Belgian or German or Italian governments because those governments host US nuclear weapons. These are the types of practical implications we could see. So we'll keep an eye on those also, because I think they're one of the areas where really proponents of the treaty hope to make a concrete impact. So I'll leave you with that. That's really my kind of just general thoughts on what the opposition to the treaty has been, where it's come from, how it's been framed, and how they've postured, and where we might go from here. But I would really welcome any of your questions, and you can either send those to me by email or get Masako to reach out as well if you have any follow-up on this issue or others.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. This is really, really interesting and stimulating lectures. So for those who are watching this lecture video, I just wanted to ask you some questions, which I assume that some teachers and students might have.
Sure.
So and also I have a lot of questions, and to be honest, I really know at this point it's so difficult to have a clear perspective, but your presentation was really stimulating, so thank you so much. So in your lecture, you repeated the position from the nuclear weapon states, which is quite understandable, although I cannot agree completely, but I see their point. At the same time, according to the procedure, the ban treaty will enter into force after, I think you also said 90 days after the 50th ratification.
That's right.
So given the number of countries that voted for the ban treaty, which is 122, many people think perhaps the ban treaty enter into force quite soon. I don't know when, and to be honest, I really don't know. So this means this treaty will enter into force without the membership of nuclear weapon states.
That's right.
So what will happen after the treaty enter into force without nuclear weapon states? Can we expect any concrete progress in nuclear disarmament? Because nuclear weapon states are the ones who have nuclear weapons. So I don't know what is going to happen after that.
I think that's precisely the point that many nuclear weapon states make. They say that because none of us are going to sign on to this treaty, it cannot be an effective disarmament measure because it will not eliminate a single nuclear weapon. There are several ways in which the treaty could still make an impact, even if you don't necessarily have the possessors of nuclear weapons on board. Again, third-party countries that are non-nuclear weapon states that join a ban could inhibit operations, planning, financing, as I mentioned previously. That's one way I think, actually, some of the civil society advocates of a ban directly said that. They're like, this is one of the only ways in which we can actually make a concrete impact with this treaty, and they will try. They'll also probably try to get some umbrella states on board, especially those who have a stronger disarmament movement internally, like Belgium or the Netherlands. I'm doubtful they would succeed, especially now given that there's been political shifts in the Netherlands, for example, that move away from this possibility for them. But actually, I think entry into force might take a little bit longer than some had previously envisioned. If I remember correctly, civil society advocates were hoping for 100 signatures on the opening day of the ban treaty, and they of course did not get that. They got, I think, 53. There's also only been 4 ratifications from my recollection, and ratification processes can take a long time. I should note also that the counter campaign by nuclear weapon states is now starting to become more active. For example, there's been direct outreach from the Secretary of Defense to the Swedish counterpart to say, don't you dare sign this. So the counter campaign is I think, dissuading some countries from coming out and prioritizing this issue. And really, you do have to prioritize it if you're going to shove it through national parliament sometimes. So I suspect actually it might take a little bit longer than people were anticipating when the ban was first adopted.
Thank you. That was not so encouraging, but I think that's the reality. So sounds like the whole purpose, actually the nuclear weapon states have no intention to collaborate with this ban treaty, not at all. So,
I don't think so.
So perhaps we cannot expect in foreseeable future nuclear weapon states are going to even agree or even start thinking about this ban treaty. But what, in your opinion, what kind of a condition are they looking for to start negotiating, not ban treaty, but some new legal instrument to really prohibit nuclear weapons? I really don't know, but when nuclear weapons, when can they really start talking about the abolition or zero nuclear weapons? Or is there any condition they're specifically looking for?
Views on this differ hugely, not only between nuclear armed states, but within nuclear armed states. I've been involved in so many debates, with US colleagues about how far you would have to get down in terms of numbers, in terms of the qualitative security relationships between specific nuclear armed countries in order to seriously talk about everyone giving them up. And really, there are very differing views on this point. There, I don't think, has been a very conscious effort to try to coordinate those views amongst nuclear armed states. The P5 in their internal talks discuss strategic stability, but I don't believe that goes as far as kind of sketching out the pathway to complete nuclear disarmament. So I think actually the conditions for this have not been very well outlined, and they definitely have not been agreed upon. We can barely get to the point of well, we haven't even gotten to the point of agreeing about how to get to a follow-on US-Russia arms control agreement. So the whole disarmament pathway seems very, very far out of reach yet.
Thank you. So it really looks like we are seeing two parallel universes. ban treaty advocates and the nuclear weapon states. But as you also mentioned, some countries are trying to make a bridge between these two parallel universes. I really don't know if it's possible, but can you also share your view on the possibility to find any middle ground or common ground between these two parallel universes?
I think it's important to note that not all of the common ground has disappeared. It's easy to think that they so adamantly disagree on this that there's no area of agreement between the various sides in this particular discussion, but the two don't disagree on the need to try to promote CTBT entry into force, on the desirability of having restrictions on fissile material, on some of the smaller, the more bilateral US-Russia agreements. No one's fundamentally disagreeing that those are things that we should be pursuing as a matter of next steps. The broader difficulty is, okay, there's that limited kind of middle ground, and then there's a pretty big gulf until you get to the other areas of viewpoints. Is there a way, not necessarily to build a bridge over that, but to walk these different viewpoints in toward each other? And that, I think, is going to take a lot of work, because it actually requires you to get either those who subscribe to nuclear deterrence or those who don't, or both, to fundamentally alter some of their viewpoints on what disarmament looks like. And no one right now, well, actually, I shouldn't say no one. Some countries are, not very many, at least on the side of those who subscribe to nuclear deterrence, are interested in having that conversation and making that effort. So I think we've got to work with that limited middle ground that we can already identify, and then see where we go from there. It's not a hugely encouraging picture, I must admit.
Yeah, but thank you. So just to clarify, they're finding a middle ground, but not in the framework of a ban treaty, right? So we have to expand our view outside the ban treaty.
So my personal view, and this is not representative of nuclear weapon states, my personal view is that nuclear weapon states at some stage are going to have to accept that a ban treaty exists, and they're going to have to work either with it or around it in some way if they want to continue to have a discussion over disarmament, and I think they will have to have that discussion. So I'm fairly, practical and realistic about the fact that this exists and is part of the disarmament architecture. It will probably not be very soon before that same pragmatic view gets uptake in most nuclear weapon state capitals. I think it will, but it will probably take a bit of time. Some have suggested in my discussions, maybe not before the 2020 review conference. I would hope it happens before then. But I still don't think that even if that acceptance arises, that there will be a willingness to use the ban treaty as a framework. So the question is, can you then, at least acknowledge the ban treaty as being part of the architecture while building, complementary or expanding existing architecture in other ways, where the focus is not the ban.
Thank you. That sounds a little bit encouraging. So both you and I were in Hiroshima last week, and there was a very interesting panel on the nuclear disarmament, and the main focus was, of course, the ban treaty. And one of the ICAN member in Japan in his speech, or I think this is a main argument by the most older ICANN. So by creating this ban treaty, of course, we can strengthen the norm against nuclear weapons, including both use and possession. Mm-hmm. So by doing so, nuclear weapons, I remember he said, by doing so, nuclear weapon states will have a more difficulty to even develop or modernize nuclear weapons, because it is, once the treaty enters into force, it will be illegal. So what do you think about this argument? I thought it was quite convincing, but I'm not sure if nuclear weapon states care about such a norm building.
Yeah, so those activities from an international legal perspective are not illegal if the country is not party to the treaty. That's the whole nature of treaty law, is a treaty can't bind a non-party. So in that respect, it's not illegal. What is illegal is for a party to the ban to assist the activities of non-parties if they violate the core prohibition. So for example, Canada cannot help modernize the US nuclear arsenal if it signs a ban. So in that respect, that would be illegal. I think what he was trying to articulate is the normative side of things, right? Where what the ban is trying to do is lay down a marker to say that it is not right that there are countries out there doing this, because half of the world thinks that's not okay. And that norm may be promoted, but I think at minimum, in order for that norm to be effectively created, the ban treaty will probably have to be fairly widely ratified and signed. Because you can imagine that if a ban, let's say, comes into force with only 51 ratifications, and everyone goes, right, it's illegal now for modernization to happen. Well, you can't say that, a majority of the world has declared it illegal. You can't even say that, it would be about a quarter of the world has declared it to be intolerable. So I think there is a quantitative element to norm development. It would also be important to look at who the countries that have ratified are. If it's, the 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, that probably wouldn't be taken as a good representative sample of the international community for the purposes of norm development. Equally, if it's, half of those countries are small island nations and reflect a tiny portion of the world's population, it probably wouldn't be read as significant for normative development. So I think there is a quantitative element to it, and we'll basically have to see as time goes on who's promoting the norm, how widely that's bought into in concrete action, and what that means for nuclear weapon states.
Okay, thank you. So for maybe final question. So even for ban treaty proponents, advocates, some countries, and as you said, there are some messy aspects in the treaty, and I also agree to that point, especially the verification and also CTBT, and those things were mentioned by countries like Sweden or Switzerland, who all voted for the treaty. So how can we improve the treaty? It's already text word already adopted. So using this ban treaty, how can we improve this treaty, including such verification issues? Is there any way to to improve, like adding some protocols or?
So that's one approach. The treaty leaves the door open to appending basically new protocols to the treaty. The treaty has to be enforced for that to happen. And I also think critically what would be needed is, for any refinement of the verification standard, is a significant amount of verification expertise in the discussion. I found that to be lacking quite a lot in the ban treaty negotiations themselves. There were, a few really good verification experts who popped in for parts of the discussion, but I don't think they were nearly widely consulted as they should have been. Similarly, I think if it were me, if there's any effort to refine the verification standard, it needs to in some way actively include countries who have nuclear weapons and have gone through a disarmament process. And I don't just mean South Africa. And I imagine there would be a lot of reluctance to engaging in anything that is about creating, more obligations as part of a ban treaty framework or expanding the ban treaty framework. So I would hope that some of the initiatives that currently exist around verification that involve nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states can start to develop the broader international level of expertise around disarmament verification, to the point that at any stage we get to where we decide we want to lay down more specifics in a text about verification requirements, that there is a very high level of knowledge about the challenges of verification, about doing that in a setting where countries, are deeply skeptical of one another, don't have trust necessarily between parties, the real, and then potentially security issues get to the challenges of those. We need to have a high level of knowledge about all of those difficulties and the mechanics of disarmament verification before we go down the path of further refinement. Indeed, I think the negotiators of this text recognized that they didn't have that expertise, which is part of the reason why the text kicks so many decisions to the future.
Okay, thank you so much. This is really informative, and you gave us a lot of things to consider, but this was really informative. So thank you so much, Andrea. And
Having me.
Thank you. And if you have any questions, and I'm sure the participants in this Critical Issues Forum are now thinking, and you do have your own opinion. So, or if you have any question, please first send it to me, and we will do our best to answer to your question. So thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.